In CSS, we have a few different ways to select elements for styling purposes. We can select them by their type, by their ID, by their class, and their attributes. We have seen a few examples early in the course, but let's go through it one more time with more detail. First, let's get the terminology right. What we have over here is called a selector, because this is how we can select an element. Now, in this example, we're selecting an element by its type, which is the body element, but we can also select an element by its ID. So in index.html, let's create a section with the ID of products. So using Zen coding, we can type section pound products and then press tab. So this generates the section element and give it the ID of products. Now to style this element, we can go to our style sheet and type pound products. So whenever we start with a pound, that means we're selecting with an ID. Now we can also select elements by their class. For example, here we can add 3 articles with the class of product. So we can type article period product times 3. This generates 3 article elements with the class of product. Okay. Now to style each article element, we can go to our style sheet and type period product. Now here's a question for you. What is the difference between the ID and class attributes? We talked about this earlier in the course, so you should know the answer. Pause the video and think about it for a second. Here's the answer. We cannot have multiple elements with the same ID, but we can have multiple elements with the same class. Here's a metaphor. In the real world, we cannot have 2 people with the same passport number, right? By the same token, we cannot have 2 elements with the same identifier. So IDs must be unique, but we can have multiple elements with the same class, okay? So these are the most common way to select elements, by their type, by their ID, and their class. But we can also select elements by their attribute, which is not really that common, but I want to cover it here because you might see it in other people's code. So over here, let's add an anchor and link to google.com. And here we can say Google. Now let's give this anchor the target element and set it to blank. Do you remember what this does? When we apply this attribute and click on this link will open in a new tab, okay? Now, let's say we want to select all anchor elements that have a target attribute. To do that, we can type a square brackets target. So we're checking for the existence of the target attribute, but the value doesn't matter. Now, if you want to be more explicit about the value, we can use an equal sign and type the value here, underline blank. As another example, let's select by the href attribute. So we can select anchor elements that point to Google, https google.com. Now there's a problem with this code. Code like this is often fragile. A simple change in this link will break our style. Let me show you what I mean. So here I'm going to set the color to orange. Now let's verify that our rule is working. So we get an orange link. Now, if I go back to index.html and add a / here, our rule breaks. The reason this is happening is because we're checking for the exact match. So that's why I said code like this is often fragile. To make our code more flexible, we can check for the existence of the word Google. So here we type Google, and then we prefix the equal sign with an asterisk. Now our rule is working, beautiful. If we make any changes to this link, for example, if we type a few more characters, our rule is still working. Now we can also check to see if the attribute starts with a given value. So here we type a caret and then replace Google with HTTPS. This will select all anchor elements whose href attribute starts with HTTPS. We can also check to see if the attribute ends with a given value. To do that, use a $sign. But we can also combine multiple conditions. For example, here I can type another square bracket and say the href attribute should start with HTTPS and end with .com. That's another way. But again, selecting by attributes is not really that common. Most of the time, we select elements by their type, ID, and class. So this is all about the basic selectors. Next, we're going to talk about relational selectors.